PDX Real, community engaged reporting, authentic and unapologetic. We tell you what the news isn't reporting and the politicians don't want you to know. Perhaps you've already noticed that our governing needs your attention. Join the conversation. Find us in both long and short format at these channels. Hello, Portland. I'm Angela with PDX Real. I'm here with Mr. John DiLorenzo. You may or may not know John. Let me give him the introduction he deserves. 42-year trial lawyer, 20 years at Davis Wright Tremaine in downtown Portland, and his favorite, he does impact law, so his favorite defendant is the government.
That's right.
And he is the lead counsel on the ADA lawsuit that just is settling as we speak in the city of Portland.
It's just settled.
Before we talk about the ADA lawsuit, I want to talk a little bit about some of the cases you've been involved in. So a few years ago, the city came out and said that people with buildings that were older buildings that were made of brick were unsafe because they call them URM, right?
Right, unreinforced masonry.
So the unreinforced masonry buildings were a danger to people because in case of an earthquake. And so they wanted, I know there's a lot to it, I'm doing this in layman's terms, but they wanted plaques on everyone's building to tell people this is not a secure building for you to enter, which could potentially hurt the businesses and people that would be willing to go into the establishments, right? And so you, with your plaintiffs, won a takings case with the city.
No, it actually wasn't a takings case.
It wasn't.
It was a First Amendment case. It was a speech case because the city mandated that every owner of a brick building had to place a placard on the building that contained language that the city dictated, but the owner had no choice and had to post it. And the city ignored other buildings that were would respond in a similar way in a major earthquake. The city forgot that even the U.S. Bancorp Tower would collapse in the size of an earthquake that would cause damage to all these brick buildings. And they made owners have to speak. And so we thought about this and we said, well, we don't think we have a takings case, but the First Amendment prohibits the government from interfering with your right to speak. It also prohibits the government from making you speak. And we felt this was a case of forced speech. And we were able to convince a federal judge that it was. And so the judge found that it violated the First Amendment to the Constitution and voided the placarding law.
I'm so amazed. Like this whole time I've thought it was a taking case, and I would have never thought to run that through the First Amendment. So I'm glad there's people like you that are a study of the law.
Now, that would be the Fifth Amendment, but the First
Amendment.
Yeah,
exactly. I just for whatever reason thought it was number 5 taking. So thank you.
You're welcome.
for telling me and others. I'm not the only person who might think that, but maybe I am. I don't know. So there was you also. There's some other cases. John, to be honest with you, I was going to talk about the timber case.
Right.
That was the biggest. That was the biggest. What's the word?
It was the largest jury verdict in Oregon history.
That's what it was. But it's been appealed now, and so I wasn't sure.
Yeah, it was a $1.1 billion jury award, which was very satisfying because it was in favor of all the rural counties that are given very short shrift by an urban-dominated legislature. Unfortunately, the appellate courts did not treat us as well as the circuit court did, and that was a big disappointment ultimately. But we still made some very important points about why there is an urban-rural divide in the state and why that divide persists across the country. Really. But the other case I was proud of, well, I've been proud of a lot of cases, but one of the cases I was proud of was an opportunity for us to recover what was ultimately $12 million on behalf of water and sewer ratepayers for expenditures that a prior city council made on things that had absolutely nothing to do with water and sewer. Now, you can't invoke the power of the courts for political reasons. And most of the problems that we encounter, have a way of politically resolving. A court will get involved if the city council or if the legislature or if some other government body is doing something in contravention to what the charter or the Constitution means. And in this case, the city charter made it very clear the water and sewer funds were only to be used for things that were connected to water and sewer service. So, we didn't think how purchasing the Rose Festival building had to do with provision of water and sewer service, or how putting the portable bathrooms all throughout the city had anything to do with water service, or whether paying candidates to run for office had anything to do with provision of water and sewer service. So we were able to get a pretty nice judgment.
Yeah, so in this...
I should say settlement. It was a settlement. Yeah.
In this series of us starting to have conversations with people that have done things in Portland to move the needle and I don't know, have justice for people, and also livability for everyone, I like to be honest, right? I like to be just real brass tacks honest. So here's the thing about you that I think is worth saying. And we talked about this at lunch whenever we first met. You are you've been pretty successful. You're self-built. You've been successful, and there is a sense of responsibility for that. And I find sometimes most people that I know in the circles I run in see you like I do. But there are some people who say, well, this man's just helping out, he's just a well-off man helping well-out interests. But the thing is what I notice is you have stuck up for so many people that didn't have any other resources, and you came in and got them justice. And so nice. That's something I think is really important. The ADA lawsuit, which is now it's been settled, and so in that there's been a couple components of that. There was a settlement in terms of how we were going to change policy to make sure that those sidewalks and streets were clear. And the second component was a settlement for people that were very harmed as a result of how our streets have been of late. And so I guess the question here is, with this ADA lawsuit, I'd like to start from the beginning. I'd love to know how it came to you and what that process looked like.
Okay. Well, I think after the riots, I was approached by many people asking, isn't there any way that we can ask the courts to instruct the city and the county to clean up their act and restore some kind of civility back to our city? And I reviewed all kinds of concepts.
I remember I called you then.
Right.
Yeah, a lot of us did. Yeah.
Yeah, and most of the ideas that were generated by the business community weren't really going to fly in court. They could fly in the political sphere, but the courts weren't going to touch them because it's up to the city to have proper police staffing. It's up to you can't force those things. So I was pretty disappointed that there weren't many ways that we could clear the streets and the sidewalks when they became populated with tents and no one could move around. I mean, they were scaring people from coming downtown. They were exacerbating the problems that restaurants were having. They were exacerbating the problems that employers were having because their employees were afraid to come downtown. There was all kinds of crime associated with these tent cities. I knew that from experience for the 12th and Taylor issues. And So I was invited by Tiffany Hammer, who, you know, to attend a meeting last March down at the Society Hotel.
Jesse Burke's place.
At Jesse Burke's place. And there must have been about 15 people in wheelchairs with a variety of disabilities. And Tiffany asked if I would just go down there and listen. And so I went down there and I listened. And to get there, of course, I had to have this tortuous navigation, you know, because there were tents blocking everywhere, you know, just to get to the hotel.
Yeah, you went to a meeting in Old Town, I get it.
And I listened, and I always objectively knew that it would be difficult to navigate if you're in a wheelchair. I never subjectively knew what it would be like. For instance, having to navigate into the traffic just to go buy a tube of toothpaste. Having to wheel through filth and debris, which would then get on your wheelchair and on your hands. And then, you know, I'm thinking, well, they just clean that off. No, people in a wheelchair can't clean the wheelchair off. They can't get out of the wheelchair to clean the wheelchair off. So, you know, I was just left with a feeling that not only was this horribly unfair, it was humiliating to anybody with a disability. And, you know, these are people who want to be contributing members of society as opposed to takers. They want to be contributors. And yet our city and county policies were having these impacts on them, and they were bearing the brunt of the burdens. They were, you know. So my first question is, well, why don't you go to some of the organizations that would traditionally defend the right of people with disabilities? And they said, we tried, and they won't listen to us. And I said, why in the world won't they listen to you? I said, because they feel that the people living in the tents who are hopelessly addicted to drugs and mentally ill are also disabled, and that we're pegging one group against the other. And I said, oh, well, did they mention that they also don't want to upset Multnomah County, which wants to house everyone in $400,000 a unit housing, thinking that people who are hopelessly drug addicted are going to take care of the housing? Okay, right. No. We didn't ask them that, but they wouldn't help us. So I said,
So side note on that, because I'll say it, Disability Rights of Oregon has had a lawsuit that made it so that we were working on major construction to make sure that the curbs were accessible. So they, in one hand, were doing a lot of policy and lawsuits that would help people that were in wheelchairs or had mobility issues. But when it came down to this, no dice.
Yeah, they were able to successfully make the city put in many curb cuts and signaling devices too, which helps. So, you know, I didn't know a lot about that area of the law at the time. And I told them, well, it seems to me that even if a person has a disability, they shouldn't be able to block sidewalks so that other people with disabilities can't navigate them, right?
Makes sense to me.
So we did some research, and we came across, which I thought was ironic, Disability Rights Oregon's prior case. It's called Hines versus City of Portland. And so I designed our ADA case to look exactly like that case.
You're a quick study.
Thinking that, well, if that succeeded, maybe we could succeed. And it took a long time to find 10 people who had the courage to resist what was pushback coming from a lot of the nonprofits and the people who were their beneficiaries, you know, who were living on the street, who zeroed in on my folks and harassed them. And so we had a long meeting. We finally found 10 people. Tiffany helped a lot. Other people helped. We identified Tiana Tozer that way. She's amazing.
Yeah,
person.
the main plaintiff. Like I've heard her speak as recently as city council last week.
Her
Amazing.
career is in traffic safety now, but she was struck by a car when she was young, and had to have over 40 surgeries. She ultimately overcame many of her disabilities and was on the Paralympic basketball team and came home with 3 gold medals, 3 separate times. And so she's really an inspiration. But and then others, Keith Martin, who was a founder of Oregon Ballet Theater and is now in a wheelchair and runs a car magazine. And then many other people from many walks of life, including people who have vision disabilities. So we got them all together around August of last year, and a couple days after Labor Day filed our case. And we went from there.
And this was record timing for settlement, 7 months for a federal case.
Yeah.
What do you attribute to that?
Well, I think this was a big reminder to those on the city council. And as you recall, there was an election happening. And Renee Gonzalez was running against Hardesty.
Mm-hmm.
Hardesty was not our friend on this whatsoever. Hardesty was 100% a permanent housing first, Kafuri, Jolin style, nonprofit industrial complex type.
Yes.
Okay. Renee couldn't be more opposite. Okay.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that was going on, and there was a lot of discussion, and our constituencies in Portland were getting to the point where they had just had enough. And so when we filed, I was expecting a lot of pushback. I mean, look, I get involved in all these controversial things. I almost always get hate mail, always, about anything I do.
I do too.
Anything I do. And I didn't get any.
Yeah.
And one person wrote and wanted to know my shirt size because he wanted to buy me a cape. And so I'm thinking, well, I think there's a sea change out there. Later, the polling reflected that sea change was actually happening, and that was reflected in the Gonzalez Hardesty race,
yes.
And that was reflected in many other ways. So I received a call from the city attorney's office, and they wanted to talk. And they thought, well, instead of slugging it out for a couple of years in federal court, maybe we can come to an accommodation.
And perhaps within the city, they were ready for some legal teeth to help them guide policy, because I think the city's frustrated too.
Well, at the same time, there was this tension between the city and the county for how to best proceed. Again, you had the county and their staff that were going to use all of this money to try to build permanent housing that would take 5 years to build, that basically condemned all these people who were on the street to an early death, because very few of them were going to last more than 5 years on the street.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And then you had the city, and to Ted Wheeler's credit, Ted and certainly Renee Gonzalez and Mingus Maps and others, and Dan Ryan too, who felt that we should first protect people from the elements and try to steer them into some kind of treatment and then transition them into housing, because we could do something for them right now.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this incredible dissonance between the county and the city. So the first thing the city asked me to do was, hey, will you sue the county too? And I said, I don't think I've ever experienced a situation where a lawyer for one of the defendants has asked me to sue somebody else too.
We want you to sue the county.
So I said, yeah, I really don't think I can, because although the county has all the money, the city has all the responsibility for the
Keeping
sidewalks.
the sidewalk, yeah.
Yeah, and the county really didn't have any responsibility. So they said, well, think about it, see if there's something else you can do. And I reviewed the contracts. First thing you want to do is review the contract for this joint office. And, you know, the joint office of homelessness is run by the county. The city has to contribute $40 million or so a year to keep it running, but has no say over what it does.
No managerial.
Nothing.
They're not leading it.
Now, that's going to change. But I said, well, let's take a look at the contract.
But for the first $1 billion,
Yeah.
it was that way.
Right.
It is that way right now.
So I
Yeah.
discovered two things that were of real interest in the contract. Number one, you know, when I review a contract, first thing I want to know is what happens if somebody doesn't perform. You know, what's the hammer, right? Well, in this case, there was no hammer. The city had every right to just stop and would have to pay a $250,000 wrap-up fee and then save a $10 million quarterly payment and $10 million quarterly payments thereafter. So I said, well, why don't you just stop paying them, and you'll have plenty of money that you can then use for
your Safe
whatever-
Rest Villages and
for-
your
yeah.
other things you're trying to do. Yeah.
The other thing I discovered was the county had agreed, it's called indemnification, which means the county would protect the city from any of its costs or expenses if the city got sued for something the county did. Okay? So I said, well, why don't we send some subpoenas over to the county now that we have subpoena power and find out really what they're doing. And lo and behold, we discover that the county used taxpayer money to put 22,000 tents and 60,000 tarps out onto the street, which is the reason we were suing the city. So I said, well, why don't you sue the county under the indemnity provision? Well, we have other things we want to work out. So I said, all right, I don't want to hear any belly aching about money anymore then.
Yeah, and I think it's a good time to go off script a little bit. Jeff, would you please bring me, now this is incredible. So they produce documents, and what we're about ready to look at is not just tents, tarps, Band-Aids, gloves, just the pickup. And the thing that was crazy about it, you can go ahead and bring it in. The crazy thing about it, I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah,
And
you want to look at the
month. So
Yeah.
so this is just 1 month. 1 month.
That's March of 2021.
It's just crazy. And then it just has, all these sign-ins for people. And some just say like selfed or some person's name, picking up like pallets of
Why
like
don't you show
tents.
show this? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're just, it's just like page after page after
let me tell you a
page.
couple things. First of all, Tiana and I went through all of these.
Yeah, the plaintiff, yeah.
Yeah, and she has helped relief efforts in war zones.
Right,
Okay.
right.
So her first thought was, I have seen better record keeping in war zones than I have seen in Multnomah County. Number one, okay. Number two, some of these names I recognize as nonprofits, and the nonprofit, whatever picked up, was down here, and then what they got
Yeah,
was
and-
across. But a lot of them are like Five Guys, or Ray, or no showing of any bona fides.
Yeah, and so they could only pick up, let me get this right, 20 tarps a day and 5 tents.
I don't
So
know.
they were coming, that's what I can
They're
see.
coming all
so
the
they're
time.
coming like every day. And we have things here like water jugs, bottles, sleeping bags, sanitizer, spray bottles, tarps, tents, blankets, hygiene kits, socks, cloth masks, bungee cords, lubricant, condoms, ponchos, procedural masks,
And by the way,
N95.
all new stuff. And
Every time,
and
yeah.
Because I was scratching my head seeing all these brand new Coleman tents.
Yeah.
Thinking, I aspired having one of those, like in the to go camping with. These are expensive.
They're expensive,
They're
yeah.
expensive. Well, you know what? No controls over how they were distributed. No requirement to even give them to people who are homeless. For all we knew, some of them could have ended up being resold on eBay. No controls whatsoever. It was a shambles.
I
But
thought you
many
were
of
going to
them
say
ended up on
something
the
else
top.
besides shambles. It was a shambles. John, you had no idea what you were going to find. You just had some clue that there was.
Well, we did. Yeah, we had some clues because one of our volunteers went to a Multnomah County budget meeting, and there was a reference to the joint office having handed out tents. And we felt that they were a de minimis number of tents, but we didn't know. And so that was enough to suggest that we ought to find out. And when we found out, we were astounded.
Yeah. And I'd like you to tell me, I'd like to move into the settlement piece.
Sure.
So tell us about, and I'm going to ask first just a few pieces of this. It's not just what the settlement's about, and I'd like you to tell us about that, but how you see that this is going to transition what we're seeing on Portland streets.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, first of all, while we're on the subject of tents, when Joanne Hardesty was the commissioner in charge of the Fire Bureau, she had the rapid response, not the rapid response, the Portland Street Response group,
Yes.
actually go to this warehouse and check out tents.
I saw them on
And
several of these.
hand
yes.
out tents besides. And I know there was a video of people who were part of that bureau crowing about a brand new sparkling van that they had purchased to hand out tents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One of our settlement terms is no more handing out tents or tarps. And that was meant to
With the city.
With the city.
With the
That
city.
was meant to back up the good work that Commissioner Gonzalez has done. For two reasons. Number one, all this was doing was enabling the problem. Number two, it was just supplying more tents and tarps to block more sidewalks. And number three, it was leading to horrific fires, many of which were injuring the very people who were inside the tents and the tarps.
They're highly flammable.
Right.
Yes.
So that's part of it. But first, we define sidewalk, and a sidewalk in this agreement is an area where pedestrians can walk 6 to 8 feet in width, unless the sidewalk isn't 6 to 8 feet, in which case it's the whole sidewalk. And it also includes access to mass transit. Okay. It also ensures that for 5 years, 40% of all the campsite removals have to be focused and dedicated to city sidewalks. And not just sidewalks downtown. This is sidewalks in all the neighborhoods, anywhere in the city of Portland. Anywhere. This is a citywide problem.
Yes.
And so 40% of all the resources have to go to sidewalk removal. Robust reporting. 24-hour reporting hotlines by telephone and online to ensure that every resident, including people with disabilities, can have an opportunity to report, take a photograph, and upload the location of a tent or a tarp or another
Blockage,
disruption,
obstruction,
on the sidewalk. A process for those who have mobility disabilities to check a box to say, by the way, I want this cleared as an ADA accommodation, in which case their reports will rise to the top. Okay. Requiring a city staffer or a contractor to access and assess the reported campsites within 5 days of every one of these reports. Now, people are saying, well, 5 days is sort of what they do now. Yeah, they're going to have 20 times the reports. So they're going to assess every single one of these within 5 days.
So, John, can I stop you? So we have that $4.8 million, might be 4.3, with the rapid response BioClean. And so that amount is obviously going to go up for...
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
I didn't know if that was specified.
They're going to consolidate all the data in a publicly accessible tracking system. So you or any of your viewers, anyone, can get into it, flag the encampment that they're concerned about, and see exactly what stage it is in its cleanup and follow it along.
Which is great, because point in time has just been a black hole sometimes.
Right. We're going to ensure that every employee or contractor of the city who engages in campsite removal is not going to do what they do today, which is, just move 2 blocks down the street. They're going to say, you are not allowed to relocate on a sidewalk. Okay? They're going to post no camping signs on frequently obstructed areas. They're going to extend the ban on giving out tents and tarps. And they're going to acknowledge their intent to adequately fund their obligations under the agreement. And that's a $20 million deal. So over 5 years, they're going to spend $20 million, $8 million minimum the first year. And that's minimum. These are all minimums. So in case there's a downturn economically or whatever, they're bound to have to spend that much money attending to these sidewalk removals. At least 500 campsite removals, and that's not tents, that's a campsite. Mm-hmm. So if a campsite has 15 tents, that's one campsite. 500 campsite removals minimum off of sidewalks per year, okay, unless there aren't any, which we hope will ultimately happen. Require the city to provide written reports quarterly on their metrics and how they're doing. Allow the federal court to enforce the terms of the agreement. If we have to go into federal court to enforce the agreement, the city agrees to pay our attorney's fees to do that. Okay. They're going to pay our reasonable attorney's fees for the whole case. Mm-hmm. To be determined by the judge, by the court. And then every plaintiff's going to get $5,000 of compensatory damages. And then there are other bells and whistles too. But those are the main components of the settlement. Now, that goes hand in glove with the mayor's time, place, and manner ordinance too, which I fully anticipate will be approved this coming Wednesday.
Yes.
And between the two, we think we're going to see some pretty quick action on the sidewalks.
And let's talk about this. I thought this was an interesting side note, this $5,000 settlement for these 10 plaintiffs. You were discussing that it was a tricky thing to set up because, they're on disability sometimes.
Well, a couple things. First of all, it took some courage to stand up to some of the other activist groups that did not treat them very kindly when they wanted to defend their rights. Number two, they had to go to a lot of meetings, and they put in a significant amount of time. And I felt they shouldn't walk away from this with nothing. They should have something, it's not a lot of money, but it's at least an acknowledgement by the city that they have suffered,
yes,
through this process. So,
and you also talked to me about, in some cases, these plaintiffs you were watching them sort of becoming more light, advocating for themselves.
Well, you know what? A lot of times people are just, frustrated because they feel there's nothing they can do to improve their lot. And I think what this series of meetings did was prove to my plaintiff group that if they advocate for themselves and if they get organized, they can affect their destiny.
Yes,
and
lovely.
So it was a wonderful experience, I think, ultimately for a lot of them.
I think there's a lot of people in Portland that are a bit apathetic, and I think that message is really important, beyond just lawsuits, like just
Well, you got to get out there and stand up for yourself.
Yes, yes.
So.
And when I first had heard about the terms of the settlement, and I was, it was lovely because I actually had a chance to talk to you about it. And one of the things that I thought about was how it seems to me in Portland or in the state that certain policy can lead how we live after that. And sometimes not always for 100% for good, right? And the one thing, so I'm always looking for, oh my gosh, is there a problem in this? And the only piece that I was a little bit concerned about was with this rolling out, how much attention was going to go towards people that I know are already having trouble in certain areas of Portland that are in, say, the Springwater Corridor or the MUP or like more green, next to green spaces. I thought, I don't know what's going to happen. But as you said, perhaps that time and place and those type of things will help assist.
Well, we have to do something first. And our view was, if we had to pick one area to have clear, the sidewalks were, a significant a choice. And I put it this way to the city team. I said, look, if you had tents blocking Southwest Broadway in a way that vehicular traffic couldn't get through anymore, PBOT would clear that up in 1 New York minute.
Yes.
Okay? There's no federal law that entitles cars to transit on Southwest Broadway unimpeded. There is a federal law that says if you're a person with a disability, you should be able to go from point A to point B unobstructed. And so, I told the city, I said, you must value cars more than you do people with disabilities.
use their thoughts against them, right?
I said, well, that's not true. That's not true. I said, well, then let's clear these sidewalks.
Excellent.
Yeah.
It's a really good point. Let's go, let's in conclusion, let's talk a little bit about what you have had, how you see what's going on with the city and county, what your concerns are,
Right.
What you want people, the average citizen, to know.
All right. Well, first of all, I think this city council and Mayor Wheeler are on the right track. I believe they negotiated with us in good faith. It wasn't an easy negotiation. They pushed back a lot. We pushed back a lot. We had to rely on three to 4 hour long meetings with our settlement judge, Judge Stacy Beckerman, who did a superb job in trying to bring us all together. But I had no doubt that they were negotiating in good faith. I cannot say the same for the county. I am still shocked at the dissonance between the city's policy, which is on the right track, and the county's policy, which is definitely on the wrong track. And, think about it. The county put 20,000 tents, 60,000 tarps on the street, spending $2 million of our money to do that so that the city could spend $8 million to clean it all up. Mm-hmm. And, somebody asked me, what do you think of that? And I said, well, it's like walking up the down escalator.
Right.
And I didn't know whether to laugh or cry about that. So I am hopeful that now that there's a new county chair, the county's going to get with it. And we have a new director also of the joint office. And I've known Dan for a long time. I haven't talked to him about this yet, but I hope they get it too. That, their policy basically condemns these folks to an early death because there is no way they're going to build all of this permanent housing in enough time to be of any use to them, even if you think that that's a wise thing to do, which I don't. I think the best thing for us to do is to protect them from the elements, lead them, as many of them as will take it, to services, and then transition into housing.
Yeah, one of the biggest things I believe that we need to be doing is outreach, daily outreach. I've been out there, and I can't tell you that I've done the most outreach of anyone in town, but I have done a fair amount. And the amount of people that I've spoken with that have never heard from anybody in social services to meet them out where they're at, we're spending a lot of money. $1 billion in 5 years we've spent. Where are the people out there talking to them?
Can I tell you why I think the county is so resistant
Yes.
to change? I think it's because the county is well on its way to establishing and I know the term has been worn a little bit, but a permanent, nonprofit, homeless industrial complex. Let's face it, years ago, if we were all part of a nonprofit, we would rely on volunteerism, right? And we would all volunteer to get something done and accomplished. And we would hope that as a result of our volunteer efforts, the problem would dissipate, and then we would dissolve and go on and do something else. Okay? Now, all of these nonprofits are, quote, professionalizing. And they're using county funds to staff up and hire people who are making decent salaries. All right. Now, if your livelihood is dependent on there being homeless people, are you really that interested in the problem going away? Or will you morph onto something else to now preserve your livelihood? Now, this isn't anything new. This happened in the 60s with Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty and his Great Society programs and the Model City programs. In fact, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who worked for the Nixon administration and the Johnson administration, was very critical of this. And he called it, with all the professionalization, he called it feeding hay to the horses so they could dole out morsels to the sparrows. And he said, we're paying sociologists so much money to study poverty. If we took the money we're paying the sociologists and just gave it to poor people, they wouldn't be poor anymore. So that was his view. But it was a waste. But what it was it was a full employment program. And it was a political full employment program because you have these nonprofits that are staffed with all kinds of people who owe their livelihood to their being homelessness. Who's going to go door to door for the county commissioners who are the architects of that program? Obviously them. So it just becomes a massive cycle. We shouldn't be doing that.
We call it the homeless advocacy cartel.
Well, all right. You have a different,
we just decided to put it, but
name.
homeless industrial
Yeah,
complex,
you have a different
absolutely.
name. But,
I appreciate that history. That's going to be really good.
Yeah,
for
this
people
is
to
nothing
hear.
new. Mm-hmm. This is a tried and true racket.
Exactly. Before we close up, is there anything that you wanted to cover?
I think I have. I think
it's been excellent.
And you're welcome to dig into these if you want.
Of course I want to.
Yeah.
John DiLorenzo did not disappoint. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much for the opportunity.
Yeah.